In this lecture, we are going to be looking at kind of the composition of culture and how culture spreads or is transmitted from one individual to the next within a culture, right? And what we're really talking about here is symbols, right? Because that's really what is how we convey different elements of our culture, right? So we're going to look at a couple different symbols. We're going to look at a few different kind of avenues in which symbols are used to convey cultural ideals and elements. And we will also continue to really define what culture really is. So first, we'll do a little bit of review from what you guys should have gotten from last week, and then we'll kind of move on to our next topic. Now, I remember we talked about Edward Burnett Tyler and his definition of culture, right? And remember that if you look out there in the world, there are many, many definitions of what is culture, right? But for the intensive purposes of our class here, we will be using Tyler's definition, right? So he developed our notion of culture. A few other things that he worked on were ideas of cultural evolution, which we talked about last time, and also cultural diffusion, or how ideas spread from one culture to the next, right? He developed the notion of animism, or the belief in a soul and all things within nature. And I'm not saying that he developed that belief. What he did was he developed a schematic system by which to look at the religions of various cultures and see precisely how their religious elements work, right? So in religions where they believe there is a soul in all things, or a soul of all things within nature, that's referred to as animism, right? So, and Tyler himself, kind of going along with his ideas about cultural evolution, believed that animism was the first stage of the development of religion, right? So along with culture, religion developed in stages as well. So remember that culture is actively created at a constant rate. This means that culture is constantly created, contested, shared, and negotiated within space and time. So culture is a shared experience, and no one individual owns culture exclusively. So culture is both symbolic and material, right? This means that culture creates objects as well as thoughts and meanings that are associated with those objects. Going back to our example from symbolic anthropology, we have the stop sign, right? This is just giving you a perfect example of symbolic and material, right? You have the material part, which is the physical sign, the metal, the paint, right, the reflective coating. This is all considered material. And then you have the symbolic part, right, which is the message that the sign conveys, right, to stop. And, you know, the reason we have these signs and the reason we attach a symbolic meaning to it is so that all members within our culture understand what the sign means and know how to act accordingly. Culture is both learned and taught. You are constantly passing cultural ideals to other people, as well as constantly learning cultural ideals from other people. So cultural practices are passed from generation to generation by the process of enculturation, right? And remember that culture is not passed biologically like genes, but gathered through experience and active teaching by our peers and our elders. So if we were to define enculturation, it's the process of learning one's culture, including acceptable behaviors and taboos or unacceptable behaviors. Remember that enculturation comes in many forms, right? Every single culture develops institutions for teaching children your culture, and these institutions run from everything from religion, like churches, right? Media to educational institutions like schools, as well as medical systems and laws, right? So like our chimpanzee cousins, though, most of the enculturation that occurs is between parents and offspring. And rearing children and passing culture to children is different in various places of the world. If we look at an example from Chilejuani in Peru, they give their children a lot more of a free and permissive childhood. As a matter of fact, the children are kind of let to kind of manage each other. They're let to play. There's not a whole lot of adult supervision. So what ends up happening out of this is concepts of reciprocity and respect are introduced at an early age. And this Peruvian is a Quechua-speaking people, and we'll talk about more Quechuan-speaking people when we talk about linguistics. But this is just an example of kind of a difference in how child rearing occurs. As soon as a child's kind of old enough to walk and move around and communicate with other children, they kind of let all the kids go off and do their own thing. And it's a lot different than what we have in our own culture, where children are kind of heavily managed and watched at all times. So if we look at one of the areas that anthropologists study when we look at culture, we have that of individual personality and how it intersects with culture, right? And one of the researchers that that really wrote a lot about this was Ruth Benedict. So she says that different cultures value different personality traits, right? Ruth Benedict was actually a student and lover of Margaret Mead, and we're going to talk about Margaret Mead quite a bit when we talk about gender and sexuality cross-culturally, because she's kind of the founding mother of gender studies within anthropology, really looking at how women's roles vary in different cultures. But in Ruth Benedict's case, she looked at the Native American cultures in the Southwest and actually determined that there were these broad patterns and two kind of general culture types exist in general, right? She called them the Apollo and the Dionysian cultures. So if we look at the schema that Ruth Benedict came up when she examined and did her ethnographic research amongst the Native American tribes of the Southwest, more particularly the Hopi and the Apache, she noticed that there were kind of differences in how the culture treats certain aspects, right? So if we look at an example, if we look at time amongst the Hopi or an Apollo type culture, according to Benedict, there's ritual based daily behaviors. There's the refusal of intoxicants. And pretty much most of their cultural rules and taboos work to maintain boundaries between individuals. If we look at a Dionysian culture type, according to Benedict, they do have a ritual calendar, but there's a little bit of flexibility in there. There is the use of intoxicants, and trance states are very common amongst the Apache. And what their cultural elements do is work to go beyond the boundaries of normal life or beyond the boundaries of a given individual, right? And so what Benedict was saying is that many different Native American tribes of the American Southwest displayed these types of culture elements, and that they can kind of be roughly divided into these two kind of personality culture types. So child rearing techniques will vary widely based on the culture, right? We are kind of used to how we raise children here in the United States, but if you're from somewhere else or we travel to somewhere else, the child rearing techniques may be a little bit different. In most societies, gender roles are essentially enforced from birth, and we'll talk about gender roles when we address gender and sexuality. By the end of early childhood, most children are well versed on cultural norms and values, right? So they know the kind of right versus wrong of their specific culture and how to act in certain cultural situations. So we have another individual that looked at the intersection of personality and culture. We have Erik Erikson, who is a student of Sigmund Freud. He believed that personality types are culturally constructed, and he studied the difference in personality formation and child rearing in the Yurok and the Sioux people of the Great Plains in the American West. So what he's kind of stated, or the end of his research, looking at the Yurok people versus the Sioux people, he learned that on average within the culture, there's not a whole lot of variation in terms of what's considered the core values, right? So he says that all personalities are constructed around these core values, right? For example, the Yurok values are miserliness, autonomy, independence from parents with free rearing children, ritualization of every day, and they're kind of closer to what we would consider closer to our own culture, right? If you look at the Sioux values, it was generosity versus cohesion. Breastfed until about 3 years old, so there's not a whole lot of independence from parents until later in life. Free ranging every day, so there's not a whole lot of ritualization, and they resisted cultural assimilation with the United States when kind of the two cultures came into contact. So if we look at social structure and its intersection with culture, culture determines social structure, and culture is influenced by language and personality. So social position dictates personality and behavior to a degree, and this kind of pattern was originally devised by Sir Thomas A. Becket. And what he was looking at is really kind of what defines a king and whether or not being the position of a king influences personality, which in turn influences the culture around you. If we look at the intersection of culture and mental illness in non-Western societies, the definition of illness may vary greatly. Individuals which would be labeled as mentally ill in our society may actually become religious figures in other societies. It's common in the Brazilian tribes of South America, in the Amazon jungle, for people with mental illness to become shamans, because in their cultures they believe that those who displayed that kind of oddity and normal behavior were kind of closer to the deities and somehow had been touched by the deities. In the Nambiquara, for example, people who are mentally ill are considered closer to the supernatural world and thus are considered perfect candidates for the role of village shamans. Mental illness relates to how we define what's considered the other or appropriate behavior and how we define cultural norms within our societies. This is showing you a Nambiquara shaman who, not saying that he is mentally ill. I don't know that for any reason here nor there. But I just wanted to throw this in here so you can see an example of kind of what a shaman in a Brazilian Amazonian tribe looks like. So where do we find symbols, which are the vehicles for transmitting culture, right? Symbols permeate every aspect of a culture, right? And symbols are found in economy, politics, social organization, rituals, and rites of passage, right? And we define a symbol as an object or idea which represents a cultural norm, ideology, or idea, right? And remember, language itself is an entire system of symbols. In terms of studying symbols, we have of course, the School of Symbolic Anthropology is founded by Geertz. And there's also another member that worked a lot on how symbol permeates culture that we'll talk about here in a second, named Victor Turner. So we look at the study of variation of a single symbol cross-culturally, and the study of the symbolic idea or notion and how it represented across different cultures, right? And we also have in the kind of School of Symbolic Anthropology, of course, you have historic symbolism, which is studying the history of a symbol across time. So our two main anthropologists that did a lot of research on symbols and symbolism is Victor Turner and Clifford Geertz, right? Victor Turner recognized links between symbolic anthropology, or the study of symbols in their social and cultural contexts, and the social psychology and psychoanalysis. So essentially what Victor Turner looked to do was to kind of merge the fields of symbolic anthropology with concepts from psychology. Geertz kind of went on further to found kind of another school of thought called interpretive anthropology, which defines culture as ideas based on cultural learning and symbols. So to give you a little background on Victor Turner, he's a Scottish social anthropologist from 1920 to 1983. In the 1950s, he did his initial field work amongst the Ndembu of Zambia. But his central career interest, of course, as we talked about, was symbolic anthropology. He was mainly concerned with cultural symbols, or as he termed them, ritual symbols, right? And he kind of stated that objects which have more or less generally shared meanings within a culture can be considered a ritual symbol, right? So, and they can be considered kind of equivalent between varying cultures. And what he used was the milk tree for the Nindembu, which was central to their religion and a central symbol to their religion, and he compared that with the cross for Christians, right? Because the cross is a central symbol for Christianity. So if we look at another social theorist and symbolic anthropologist, Mary Douglas, and her ethnography, Purity and Danger, she did a study of moral symbols related to impurity, like the Old Testament dietary laws that we see in the Jewish faith, and related rituals to quote unquote stay pure within various cultures, right? And she studied the symbolic significance of basic activities. For example, she asserted that the changes in the Vatican II policy affecting symbolic qualities of the Mass, things like abstinence and the habits worn by some religious orders weakened these social rituals and thereby the social boundaries of Catholicism. And kind of another way of putting this, what she was really looking at was how ritual activities act as a cement within a religion of a culture, right? And if you start to make alterations of to those ritual practices, then you start to see differences in how that religion is going to be expressed within a culture. So, in essence, it kind of weakens the cohesiveness of, for in Mary Douglas's example, it weakened the cohesiveness of Catholicism. So just to kind of show you how complex a single symbol can be, if we look at this particular symbol, this one has multiple meanings. If you go with one of the kind of socially accepted or kind of the more commonly accepted meaning for it, it's a racist symbol that's used to kind of talk about remind people of slavery and to kind of act as a denigration towards people of color. The second use for the symbol and the second explanation that has been widely accepted is that it's a kind of source of regional pride, right? You use it as kind of to symbolize that you are from one of the southern states who was once a member of the Confederacy. And then, of course, you have the third meaning, which is the actual history behind the flag itself. It's actually a battle standard flag for a regiment in Virginia during the Civil War, right? So it wasn't actually kind of a quote unquote official Confederate flag. It just kind of became that culturally. So this shows us several different things. One, that a single symbol can have multiple meanings within a single culture, as well as that meaning can change dramatically over a given course of time, right? Starting out as kind of the symbol that was used to indicate a regiment on a battlefield to this kind of idea that it's the Confederacy flag and representing slavery and racism to this idea that it represents the regional pride. So it's kind of really, really interesting how this symbol has changed and can, depending on who you are, the meaning can vary dramatically. So the point to all of this is that symbols like language and culture are actively negotiated in live time, right? And symbols can be created at any time and will likely have some sort of notion of projected historicism, kind of with the idea that they have always existed. And symbols can turn into elements of cultural traditions, right? With things like our Christmas tree, which acts as a symbol not only for the kind of commercialized version of the Christmas holiday, but also for certain Eastern European Christmas traditions heavily feature the Christmas tree. That's just giving you one example of a symbol that can become a element of a cultural tradition. So let's look at an example of something that anthropologists will study cross-culturally in terms of symbols, right? And one good thing is the symbolism of food. And food has many metaphoric meanings within various cultures. Food can represent lust, it can represent warfare, it can even represent marriage or ideas about marriage. In many cultures, food and sex are interconnected, right? Food is used as a metaphor for sex, and food is linked to sex in two ways, right? We have the physiological kind of link, which is the PTHRP loop in the limbic system in the brain. That's essentially, in other words, the reward pathway in our brains, which becomes stimulated both when we eat delicious food as well as when we engage in sexual activity. Also, we have metaphorically in various cultures, the genitals are considered food for each other in terms of your sexual partner, right? And you can even look at the ad here, this Arby's ad featured on the right here, and it kind of has an idea of sexuality or sexualism in the ad itself. So if we look at an example of food as sex, we have the Mehinaku of northern Brazil on the Tuatara River. Their language, of course, comes from the Arawakan language family of northern South America. They primarily kind of sex and food intersect where they have their main crops, which are manioc and maize, that act as phallic symbols within their culture. So each food item to them represents an element of either male or female genitalia. So if we look at the Mehinaku marriage ceremony, marriages are arranged by the parents and usually an older male and a younger female, an average of 4 years difference in age. Marriage is initiated by the male carrying his hammock over to his prospective wife's house. And he must perform food gathering functions to prove he is a good at procreation, right? So there you see another link between sex and food within the Mehinaku culture. And during the kind of hammock carrying ceremony, the married men gather in front of the men's house and make baby noises at the prospective prospective future husband, right? So it's kind of in jest to tease him a little bit, but also to kind of cement the idea that if he is good at gathering food for his prospective wife and his new family, then he will be very successful at procreation. So if we go back to another example, we look at the Trobriand Islanders that I've mentioned before. Food to them is a metaphor for marriage. If people are seen eating together publicly, then they are essentially considered married. So people who are not married do not eat, members of the opposite sex do not eat with one another unless they are married. The wedding dress itself that you can see here and kind of how its positioning is, it indicates readiness for childbearing based on its position of coverage, right? So depending on, and really this is, that's kind of a rough translation from their language. Really what it is depending on the position of the skirt, it really indicates whether or not they are married or unmarried. If we look at another example of how food and symbolism intersect here, we have an example from the Mari Baluk of adulterous eating, right? The Mari live in Pakistan, and there's not a whole lot of them left. In the Mari tribe, husbands and wives do not eat together. So adulterous couples will break this rule to show everyone their amorous feelings for one another, right? And this is kind of due to the nature of their marriages being arranged at a very, very early age. As a matter of fact, you can see kind of the prospective marriage partners who will be matched up in the photo in the bottom left, right? So arranged marriages begin at a very, very early age. And so this is kind of quite the opposite of the Mehinaku that we looked at, where they were eating, husbands and wives were eating together. This is a situation quite the opposite, where if two couples are seen eating together, then that means that they are two lovers that are essentially cheating on their spouses. You also have gendered food roles amongst the rural Rashathan. And this is kind of just an example. We'll talk about this a little more when we talk about gender and sexuality and how that intersects with food. But just to give you an example, after a death, I'm going to butcher the pronunciation here, but the Rashathan men will prepare and serve the food, a role that is normally fulfilled by women in other contexts within their culture, right? So this is just showing you that gender and food can vary within a specific cultural context. If we look at another intersection of how symbols are used within culture, we have social groups or social affiliations using symbols, right? And an example that we like to use is the totem, right? The totem itself is used by various cultures. It's used by many Native North Americans like the Ojibwe, the Cuyahoga, the Iroquois, the Sioux. It's used by the tribes in New Guinea like the Arapesh and the Dani. It's also used in the United States, right? Your kind of sports mascots can be considered totems of those sports teams. So it can be represented by masks, carvings, or idols. And essentially, at least amongst indigenous people and kind of smaller societies, totems are generally associated with clan groups, or which are kind of clusters of several related families. In many cultures, totems represent a connection to nature and to family, and clan groups are comprised of several related kin groups or several families. Totems may vary or be part of a dichotomy, right? Having one clan being the Sun Clan and the other being the Moon Clan, or another example would be one clan would be the Light Clan, the other would be the Dark Clan, right? That kind of dichotomous opposition, right? And these dichotomous clans are generally referred to as moieties. And moieties are most commonly found amongst indigenous groups in South America. So this is showing you what the kind of clans are for the Canela tribe, which is another Amazonian tribe in Brazil. And this is showing you the different clans and the circle actually represents the layout of their village, right? And you can draw a line down the middle with a certain set of kin groups living on the left side of the village and another set of kin groups living on the right side of the village. And those clans are direct opposition of one another. So, and normally we see really clans and totems being played out in culture through marriage practices. For example, in this example, the Boa clan or the Haka clan up in the top left would marry the opposite clan from the opposite moiety, which is the Kupe or the alien tribe clan. So this just shows you how kind of symbolism and totems and clans and kind of marriage practices as well as kin groups all intersect within culture. This is just a photo of some Quaquiatl totems from the American Northwest. And each of those totems represents various spirits and kind of physical representations of spirits which represent nature. And each clan has their own kind of totem pole design as well as animal kind of representatives that they use in their totem pole motif. We also see the use of symbols playing out in how different cultures use space. For example, we're going to look at the Dani people who live in New Guinea in the South Pacific. So as per the Dani religion, they have a very strict and symbolic use of space. The Dani themselves believe the world is divided into two essential halves, a male half and a female half. So all space and activities during a given day are divided into male and female, right? Males and females only come together to perform familial activities and to kind of copulate in order to produce children. So inside the home of the average Dani family member, the space is divided into male and female only zones where each, the opposite sex is not allowed to transgress. And the symbolic use of space is very important because it relates back to their religious beliefs, right? In the Dani kind of religion, they believe that a male influence in a woman's space will decrease or diminish the woman's fertility. The female influence also will destroy male power as well as his influence amongst his male peers, right? So this is why they have that ritual use of space. Women, and particularly women's blood, is seen as a polluting force, and sex is seen as pollution to the body by both men and women within the Dani culture. An example of kind of the symbolic or ritual use of space that comes out of the subfield of archaeology within anthropology is how we figured out the ritual use of space amongst the indigenous Maya at the height of their state power during the 5 to 800 BC region and or period during ancient Mesoamerican history. So what we've kind of gleaned so far from the iconographic evidence as well as the archaeological artifacts that were found, we know that in the Maya, the small building that we find at the top of their pyramid symbolized the top of the tree of life, which is part of their cosmology. Caves themselves, which we always kind of find different altars and things like that inside of caves that kind of had elements that were linked to their beliefs on the underworld, because the caves symbolized gateways to the underworld, which were guarded by what they call these giant wheats monsters. If you look kind of in the bottom of the photo here on the right, you'll see that the bottom is kind of like a skeleton-like jaw with kind of teeth there in the middle, and that is kind of the visual representation of one of these wheats monsters that guard the entrance to the underworld. So the Maya themselves, during the entire construction of their cities, were a symbolic or ritual use of space. Another example that you might be more familiar with is the necropolises and things like that from Egypt, right? Which and the Great Pyramids from Egypt, which were all symbolic or ritual uses of space through the building of pyramids and monuments. So we also see symbolism in sports. We already talked about kind of the obvious thing that we see in terms of symbolism, which is the use of totems by kind of U.S. sports mascots. But I want to talk about another one that we see, a game that is still actually played today in parts of Mexico, the Mayan ball game, which is actually heavily laden with symbolism and is really, at its very core, a kind of symbolic recreation of their story of how the universe was created. So in the Mayan kind of creation story and cosmology, there's a story of two twins. They're called the hero twins, and they go through this journey through the underworld. And the Mayan ball game is actually supposed to be a representation of that journey that those hero twins go on. So the symbolism of the ring itself in which they're trying to throw the ball in will change with the direction in which the ball is going. If the ball is going from south to north through the ring, the player is entering essentially into the underworld and dies to a terrestrial being state, right? If it is going from north to south, he gets out from the underworld after having been reborn in a higher being state, which gives him access not only to the terrestrial world, but also to the celestial world within the Mayan cosmology. So in essence, the Mayan ball court itself is kind of a micro representation of the Mayan universe and according to their religious beliefs and their creation story. So by playing this game, they're reenacting the story of creation and they're acquiring these kind of accolades based on the kind of who's victorious within the games. And for those of you that maybe have heard of this game before, there actually is no archaeological evidence that the heads of the losers were cut off and used as balls. As a matter of fact, you can see in a photo below, this is generally what we find in terms of the artifact. This is a Mayan ball from about 500 BC. And they're mostly just kind of these small balls made out of various rubbers that you find from jungle trees. We also have symbols within bodies, right, or what we call in anthropology body metaphors. And these are metaphors of symbol which relate to objects or relate objects in the world to the human body. If we look at an example, you have the Koa in Indonesia view the land itself as kind of a body, the rivers being the circulatory system, the plants in exchanging their oxygen being the lungs, the volcanoes and things like that being the sexual organs. So the lava of the volcanoes that comes spewing out in some of these Indonesian cultures is either viewed as kind of reproductive fluids or viewed as kind of the blood of the earth, right? They also view their homes as symbolic bodies as well. And finally, we'll kind of start wrapping up here with talking about symbols as power within different cultures. And symbols are used as a mean to create group solidarity and solidify power within a given culture, right? And power symbols may be used to control certain behaviors or to essentially control your votes or things like that. So we're all familiar with kind of the two mascots that are used for the Democrat and the Republican Party within the U.S., right? Those are considered symbols of power. Studying power in anthropology really came about with a guy named Eric Wolf in the 1990s who argued that power is a part of all human relationships and permeates the way we actively construct culture, right? So Wolf urged anthropologists to consider power relations when conducting fieldwork. In essence, what he's saying is that you as the anthropologist have a certain degree of power over your subjects and your subjects have a certain degree of power over you as well, right? And power is defined as the ability to bring about change through action or influence. If we look at different elements of power within a culture that anthropologists will generally look at, we look at stratification, which is the uneven distribution of wealth and resources among participants within a given group or culture. We look at what's called hegemony, the ability of a dominant group to create consent and agreement within a population without the use of force. And we also look at marginalization within culture, the pushing of a group of people with opposing views to the fringe of society by using cultural institutions to delegitimize their viewpoints. And we'll talk about this a lot later when we talk about power and politics further on in the semester. So if we look at some examples that you might be more familiar with in terms of going to college and taking college courses. So a collegiate example of how power in human relationships is recognized can be seen with the ethical restriction of professors dating students, right? Some may argue that both individuals are consenting adults, but the inherent power structure within the teacher to student relationship gives more coercive power to the professor, whether that professor is male or female. The professor can potentially control the academic future of the student, so thus it is considered highly unethical for a teacher to date a student regardless of the age or whether or not there's an age difference at all. So this same recognition of power variances and abuse within human relationships is currently playing out in the national news with the Me Too movement and the recognition of sexual harassment in multiple industries and these power differentials. So how is power maintained? Well, power is maintained through the use of enculturation, right? So those in power control cultural institutions and how those institutions portray certain behaviors or groups of people. Those in power will use cultural institutions to reinforce ideals and cultural structures which protect their own power, right? An example of this is using schools and media to promote unregulated capitalism as the only viable economic system when it has been shown to create large disparities in wealth comparable to that of pre-revolutionary France. And it just is just kind of this is one example of using a cultural institution to enforce a certain idea, not in the sense to brainwash the people, but more just to kind of lead them down a particular path and not make them aware that there are actually alternative lines of thinking out there.